Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to Edinburgh Napier University. My name is Professor Hazel Hall. I'm the Professor of Social Informatics in the School of Computing here, and I'm also the university's Research Lead for Equality and Diversity. Before I introduce our speaker, I've just got to say a couple of housekeeping things to you. One is that there are toilets on the levels where we are now and downstairs. If you went out of this room, it's on the left-hand side, and there's ladies and gents toilets on both levels. Also, there are no fire alarm practices planned tonight, so if the alarm goes off, we have to treat that as a serious fire alarm. Okay, so that's is out the way. I'm really delighted that today we've got Professor Jim Al-Kahlili here at Edinburgh Napier University. He's an award-winning scientist, author, and broadcaster. And as well as that, he maintains a job as a professor of theoretical physics at the University of Surrey. He's well known for his public engagement work through all his books and his broadcasts. And I'm one of those people who looks out for programs and radio broadcasts from Jim. In fact, I think I got to know him best of all by listening to podcasts in the car, driving up and down the country, listening to the Life Scientific. And I'm just one of about 2 million people who tune into that program each week. I'm delighted that Jim's here to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the death of John Napier. And I should also say we have some members of the Napier family in the audience as well, and we're really pleased to have people who share the same surname as the person after whom the university is named to be with us this evening. The lecture's going to look back a little bit, and it's also got to look forward to seeing what science is going to hold for us in the future. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm sure you're really looking forward to it. And I'm going to hand over to Jim now, and he can tell us what he has to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hazel. Well, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is my third time up in Edinburgh in about 6 weeks, I think. I was here for a physics conference and then for the book festival a few weeks ago and back again. So yeah, it's great. Home from home. The lecture I'd like to give you, as Hazel mentioned, it's in a way it's to celebrate, to commemorate John Napier, the 400th anniversary of his death back in 1617, but to use that as an example of how science progresses and how much the world changes and how quickly the world changes, and that change is exponential. So most of what I want to talk about is whether I'm going to try and predict the future, predict what science will look like 10, 20, 30 years from now, with all the pitfalls, all the worries and concerns that we have, as well as all the technologies and the wonderful innovations that some that we know are happening because they're sort of started to happen now, and others that may be less expected. And I want to end speculating a little bit in the far future, just to give you a little bit of fun. Let me say something about John Napier. He was a mathematician, born and lived in Edinburgh. He sort of put it in the context of world science. He was a contemporary of Galileo's. He tended to do his work alone. I mean, there are records of him collaborating and corresponding with Tycho Brahe, the great astronomer, and other mathematicians who would come to visit him and work with him. But by and large, he worked alone. He is, I guess, for a lot of you, if you're associated with Napier University, you will know something about John Napier and why he's famous. By and large, I guess he's most famous as the inventor of logarithms. Now, logarithms or some form of logarithms as a mathematical tool have been around for a long time. But John Napier probably did more than most in showing how useful they are. I'm not going to give you a math lecture about how to use let's just say it's a way of solving problems. For example, if you want to multiply two big numbers, you take the logarithms of those numbers, and then it just becomes a problem of addition rather than multiplication, which is easy. We don't have to worry about them by and large these days because we have computers to do all the hard thinking and hard work for us. the book Logarithmorum here, as you can see, so it's got, you can see in the middle, Ione Napero, which is the Latin for John Napier, Scotto, just so you know, he's Scottish. And you can see the date, MDCXX, so that's 1620, 3 years after he died. That's that edition, but he actually wrote his famous book on logarithms a few years before he died, in 1614. What is also well known for, is quite sort of a neat device, known affectionately as Napiers Bones. They're not his bones. These are special calculating rods. Again, it's a way of multiplying numbers where rather than go through the whole process of multiplying, it becomes an exercise in adding numbers instead. So you'd have two numbers at the top that you want to multiply, and you rotate these cylinders and align them, and then when you've got the numbers that you want to multiply, you can read off at the bottom just by adding up numbers. So again, a calculating device, an early computer, I guess, in many ways. John Napier died a few years after Galileo first looked up at the sky using a telescope. If we sort of ran about then, you know, the late 16th, early 17th century, science was undergoing a revolution. Following the Renaissance, and you know, you had Copernicus and Vesalius, people like that leading the way, and then, you know, Galileo and Kepler, and followed by Isaac Newton and so on. So it was a time of great change. But if we think about how science is changing today, that all sort of pales into insignificance. You're talking about discoveries, and we say, oh, that was the scientific revolution. But as we progress, as we develop in our knowledge and understanding of how the world works, so advances and discoveries come ever more quickly. The world today can be quite depressing at times. I mean, never mind the natural disasters that we don't seem to be able to anticipate or do much about, whether it's hurricanes or earthquakes. The political climate is rather unsure. You know, I think it's not that long ago, 10, 20 years ago, at the turn of the millennium, everyone was a bit more positive about the world. There seems to be, you know, the problems, you know, pre-9/11. The world seems to be getting its act together. But even without all the politics and whether or not we think Trump is an idiot, but of course we all do, there are challenges facing the world. Population numbers increasing and increasingly struggling for limited resources. We have that shadow, the threat of climate change over us, and what we do about it, how we mitigate against the worst case scenarios. Usually, very often, when people talk, futurists talk about what the world is, what we need to solve, there are the triumvirate, these three problems. We need to have enough energy, enough food, enough water. And they're all interlinked. How do you provide enough of these crucial resources for a population that is increasing in size? The demand will increase, you know, so whether we think we've got enough now, just a decade or two away, we're going to have to look for 50% more energy, 50% more food, and so on. And of course, climate change plays a role in that, because we can't just solve these problems without making things worse for the Earth's climate. So science is one of the ways that we're going to have to, you know, one of the tools we use to tackle the problems that we're going to face in the future. Now, in 2015, the United Nations gave these sort of 17 sustainable development goals by 2030. It's sort of a motherhood and apple pie wish list. We'll eradicate disease, get rid of all poverty, make sure blah, blah. But it's an important list to say, look, these are all the issues that we could think of that we really need to tackle globally. How do we go about it? And of course, for me as a scientist, the interesting question is, what can science do about that? So regardless of how technology and science is changing and what wonderful new discoveries we're going to make, what wonderful new innovations we're going to see that make our lives better, hopefully, we have problems that we still need to tackle. So I'll get all the depressing stuff out of the way first, okay, and then be a bit more optimistic. So in terms of the demographics and world population and the challenges there, we have an aging population. We're living longer. That should be a good thing, but of course it brings with it challenges. We have population increase. We have population movement, whether it's for economic reasons, whether it's geopolitics, and increasingly we're going to see population movement due to climate change. Low-lying areas around the world are going to have to deal with rising sea levels. And it doesn't take much of a rise in sea levels to cause problems in many parts of the world. Radical ideologies that seem to be increasingly getting a hold and don't seem to be sort of obvious political solutions. And of course, then there are other issues to do with environment and sustainability. In technology, not all new technology just comes for free and we welcome it with open arms. There are lessons that have to be learned. There are discussions that have to be had. Cybersecurity is going to be increasingly important around the world. I mean, it's going to lead to lots of jobs, I guess. That's one positive. AI and robotics, I'm going to talk about that later on, as I am going to say something about genetic engineering. In medicine, we have the worry of pandemics, we have the worry of antimicrobial resistance. These are huge, huge issues that many will say we're actually facing a global crisis in at the moment. And there are other, with an aging population, there are issues like dementia that still medicine is trying to tackle. So all these problems are going to need, obviously, political will. They're going to need the sensible economic policies. They're going to need innovation, education, and of course, science. So science, sometimes scientists will give the impression that we're smart, we'll figure it out, and science has all the answers. But of course, that's not the whole story, and there are lots of other factors that need to come into play. But I'm not a politician, I'm not an economist, so I want to focus only on what science is going to be available for us in the coming decades, how it's going to change our world, and in ways that we couldn't possibly imagine. If we think we've come 400 years from John Napier, and think about if you take John Napier and put him 100 years in the future, will he, there will be innovations that, as far as he's concerned, will be remarkable and miraculous. Put him 200 years in the future, but every century, it'll be, the advances are that much, take someone from the 18th century and put them in the 19th century, they won't be as amazed or blown away by someone that you take from the 19th century and put in the 20th century. And likewise, if you take someone from the 20th century and put in the 21st century, because the advances are increasing ever more rapidly. And I'll show you an example of what I mean by this. If you plot a graph of human progress against time, right? And here's our now, 2017. And we think about how human progress, so the origin is, I don't know, go back to the Stone Age, when humans first started farming. Progress, obviously, is slow, but the more you know, the more you learn, the faster we progress. But we do tend to think that progress is linear. So very often you'll hear people say, we've had the internet and the World Wide Web for 25 years now, okay, around about 1992, when it sort of people became sort of widely familiar with the World Wide Web. That's only 25 years, and think how much the internet and the web have transformed all our lives. Think, wow, if that change is going to happen in the next 25 years, what is it going to be like 25 years from now? But that's still thinking linearly. We assume the last 25 years is going to be the same as the next 25 years. We should be thinking, of course, exponentially. I'll draw the plot again. I've shifted the now to a bit further to the left. So there's that curve that I showed earlier. and imagine some time in the future. It's not important how far in the future that is. If you look back, extrapolate, say, how much we have advanced in the last 25 years, and I draw a line from 25 years ago to now, and extend that line to the point in the future, that's a trajectory based on growth in the past. But we can do better. What if we extend that curve, just extrapolate the curve up a bit, there's our still our now, and draw a tangent to that line to show the development rate that's happening now. Right? It's faster than it was in the past, but it's not as fast as it's going to be in the future, but that seems to be a more reasonable thing to do. And extend that line, we're going to get, be progressing obviously much more. But you can see, if I extend the line up naturally the way it should go, exponentially, there's the correct point that will arrive in the future. So the advances that we've seen in the last 25 years, we may see the equivalent advance in the next 10 or 15 years. Imagine something equivalent of the invention of the internet and the World Wide Web and how it has transformed all our lives. The equivalent happening 10 years from now. What might that be? Artificial intelligence, for example, and robotics. For me, 10 years that's a blink of an eye. 10 years ago was yesterday. Time runs faster the older you get. So it's not some vague notion that science is going to change in the future. Yes, and we have to be prepared for it. We've got to be doing something about it right now. Science fiction, of course, and Hollywood do a great job, I think. The movies that you see that are sort of painting a picture of a near future, it doesn't have to be a near future of Terminators and Skynet and machines ruling the world. But you do see some really neat innovations, whether it's flying cars, whether it's robots, whether it's smart cities. How much of that is true? How much of that is likely to happen? Well, probably quite a lot of it. We still don't have the hoverboards from Back to the Future, but we have other things that are equally amazing. Can we predict what the world would look like, say, in 2050? Well, that's a long way off. You think, well, it's impossible. How could we possibly anticipate the surprises that science and technology is going to throw up in the next few decades? But we can, to some extent, because there are technologies that are going to come to fruition based on science that we know today. Discoveries that maybe only in theory, maybe only as concepts or in a lab, we can see roughly how long they will take, and we know they will happen. And by and large, a lot of these technologies, it's not a case of whether we should go down that road or not. We are going to be going down that road. What we need to do is make sure that we have absolutely nailed down an understanding of the implications of what we do, discussing the ethics of a lot of these scientific innovations, being prepared for what possibly could go wrong. Science in itself is not good or evil. Science is learning about how the world works. And enlightenment is always better than ignorance. But it's how we make use of that knowledge that is important. Don't blame Einstein for E equals mc squared. Blame the politicians that used it to build atom bombs. So I've mentioned this example. In the past 25 years, we had see the rise of the internet. Maybe the next 25 years, we'll see the rise of AI. And 25 years is an arbitrary number. I mean, there's nothing special about 2042 other than it's 25 years in the future, and I'm saying we've had the internet for 25 years. But AI, if you follow the news, it seems increasingly in the last year, people have been talking about how robots might be taking so many jobs, to what extent artificial intelligence is going to be controlling lives and controlling the way we live. let's look at miniaturization. Here's an example of scales of size of objects. So my background, my expertise is quantum physics. I'm a quantum physicist. I've spent 30 years studying the atomic nucleus, which is the tiny core of matter inside every atom, where quantum mechanics, that wonderful, weird, wacky theory of the microscopic world, is, I mean, that's the playground of quantum mechanics. What does the atomic nucleus look like? But you don't need to zoom down to the nucleus of an atom to see strange effects happening and seeing new phenomena emerging. If we think about the objects in our everyday world, something like a tennis ball, you drop it down from 10 centimeters down to a millimeter, the eye of a needle, and you go down through large biological cells, down to smaller cells, down to maybe viruses, down to the molecules of life themselves, DNA. Once you get to that scale, down at the level of DNA, we're down at what's called the nanoscale. Now, a nanometer is a billionth of a meter, a millionth of a millimeter. And once you get down to that size, the rules of mechanics, the laws that describe how tennis balls behave, have to be discarded. There's a new mechanics that needs to be used to describe how objects behave, quantum mechanics. Of course, you get smaller the molecules down to the level of atoms, then of course, we understand that even if you don't have a background in physics, even in popular culture now, we know that atoms are weird. You hear about atoms being in two places at once, or atoms being able they're fuzzy and they're spread out and they behave in very strange ways. Well, that's quantum mechanics. It says that the way atoms move and interact and the particles that make up atoms fit together are subject to some very strange rules and very strange physics. We are now, in technology, working down at the nanoscale. Already you hear in popular culture and in Hollywood movies and in science fiction books things like nanobots, machines that we can build that are down at the scale of a billionth of a meter, down at the level of, say, the double helix of DNA. What's this going to lead to? What's the world going to look like if we can make use of the nano world? Well, nanotechnology, the idea of building machines down to the nanoscale, is a huge area of research at the moment. As is another field in the life sciences, genetic engineering. The idea that we can control we can play around with the molecules of life down at the level, down at the scale of those molecules themselves, the scale of DNA, in a very precise way now. There's also a field where many scientists around the world and many governments are pouring a lot of funding into something called synthetic biology. That doesn't necessarily mean artificial life. No one has created artificial life yet, right? Despite ever since Frankenstein's monster, the only way so far we know how to create life is through other life. But synthetic biology is about playing around with aspects of biomolecules to design them to do a job that's very useful. For example, delivering drugs in medicine or something like that. And then, of course, down at this miniature scale, we also are faced with the quantum world, and there's a whole area of what's now called quantum technologies. So these are technologies that make specific use of the strange rules of quantum mechanics. You may have heard that many scientists are working hard, and have been for the last decade or two, to build what's called a quantum computer. So this is a computer that, like nothing that we know now. No one's made a working quantum computer yet, but a quantum computer can make use of the rules of quantum mechanics to allow it to explore multiple possibilities simultaneously. I mean, be much more powerful in solving certain tasks than the most powerful supercomputer we have today. There are lots of other areas in quantum technology that are very, very exciting. Quantum cryptography, for example, is something that you're going to hear increasingly in the coming years. Well, all these 4 different areas at the moment are not really connected. How long will it be before we see a new area of science and technology called quantum bioengineering? It might be called something else. But making use of the rules of quantum mechanics and making use of the molecules of life and building nanoscale machines in a way that is going to transform our world way beyond anything we could possibly imagine now. That's, that's what, a decade away maybe? So that's an example of technologies that require lots of sciences from lots of different disciplines. We still, when we study science at school, we study physics, chemistry, biology, as though they're completely separate subjects that have nothing to do with each other. If you become a professional scientist, of course, you see the interrelation between them. When I mentioned I was in Edinburgh in the summer for a conference, it was a conference on biophysics. Biophysics means, people from biology and physics working in an area, an interdisciplinary area. So we're seeing increasingly the big challenges facing the world, and certainly the big challenges that science is addressing, need expertise from computer scientists, from engineers, from geneticists, from physicists, from mathematicians, from chemists, all coming together. So there's a realigning, a redefining of the exciting areas of science. And that's one example. I want to say something about genetic engineering. I don't know if Hazel mentioned at the beginning, I present this Radio 4 program, The Life Scientific, and it's just started a new run on Tuesday when I interviewed this woman, Jennifer Doudna. She's an American geneticist and the co-inventor of this technique called CRISPR. CRISPR, I've expanded what the acronym stands for, but it's not likely to mean much to people. Clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats. There. So what is it in English? Essentially, it's a technique that was discovered naturally. Bacteria have used this trick in order to attack viruses that might come in and try and infect them. And what it means is that, so we've borrowed from nature, and what's been perfected by Jennifer Doudna is the idea that you can deliver this gene editing tool to a specific part of the DNA, target a particular gene that you don't like, and snip it out. One gene. So whereas genetic engineering until recently was putting, a bit rough and ready, so a sledgehammer to crack an egg to solve a problem, now it's becoming so precise that you can target very specific genes. And one hopes that it can tackle many illnesses and disorders that are genetic in origin, like sickle cell anemia, like cystic fibrosis, like Huntington's, like HIV. It won't be long, one hopes, in the future, that this technique, which is already with us, although it was only invented back 5 years ago, already scientists around the world are seeing the huge, huge promise that it shows, that you can imagine not too long from now when these genetic disorders can be eradicated. But, there's not always a but in this case there is a big but, you can also use it for what's called germline editing. Genetic engineering of an embryo, designer babies. And there, suddenly, you're faced with the full horror of what could be done if this is misused. The idea of selecting certain traits. It makes the eugenics movement of half a century ago seem tame in comparison. And so here is a wonderful opportunity that's going to transform medicine, that's going to change the world for the good, But at the same time, we worry about how do we stop people misusing it. And in fact, Jennifer Doudna herself, who, by the way, there's a good chance she will be winning the Nobel Prize in a fortnight's time for her work. She's up for the Nobel. The only reason she won't win it this year for physiology and medicine is because there are still politics involved about who invented it, and there are various outstanding patents, and so the Nobel Committee may not be quite sure who gets the prize. So Jennifer Doudna worked with another researcher, Emmanuel Chartier, who I think both of them will get it, but you can award the Nobel Prize to 3 people, so who will be the 3rd person if indeed they choose someone else. So it may be that they don't get it until next year. But that's how important it is. It's going to get her a Nobel Prize. She's already left her lab. She doesn't do research anymore. Her full-time job now is discussing the ethics of CRISPR and how we make sure that it's used properly, and how we make sure it's not used for things like creating designer babies. You might say, and you hear this term, well, let's see, that's what happens when you start playing God. That you're starting to mess with creation itself. If you have a tool like this that can eradicate these genetic disorders, isn't it utterly immoral not to use it to eradicate those diseases? You can't just uninvent something because it might be used for ill, when you can see how much good it can be used for. So it used to be very often in science that scientists didn't have to worry about the ethics of what they do. Doctors did. In medicine, there was always the understanding that there are ethical implications, moral issues that they needed to grapple with. But most of science didn't. Maybe the Manhattan Project is an example of those physicists who worked in Los Alamos during the Second World War to build the atom bomb, and you see how many of them turned away from science completely after the atom bomb was dropped on Japan. But by and large, scientists haven't really had to concern themselves with the ethical implications of their research. Increasingly, that's becoming impossible, that we really do have to face up, whether it's in genetic engineering, whether it's in nanotechnology, whether it's indeed in things like artificial intelligence. So here's an example of something that will transform our world, but it's not just doing the science, it's making sure we know what the implications are and we're ready for it. I want to turn to artificial intelligence because that, I guess, in a way, is likely to be what is going to transform our world to the greatest extent, in a way that the internet has in the last couple of decades. You may have heard of the phrase, the Internet of Things. What that simply means is that many objects, appliances, buildings, transport, infrastructure of society are going to be interconnected. They're going to be talking to each other. So, from the mundane examples like, your fridge realizing that you're running short of milk and it beeps your phone and tells you, or maybe just contacts Sainsbury's and says, deliver some more milk. You don't even have to worry about it. Your fridge talks to the supermarket and the supermarket gets it all. Some drone will deliver your milk for you and stick it in the fridge without you even worrying. But I remember talking to one technologist who said, I look forward to the day when even my socks have their own IP address. Everything talks to everything else. Smart clothing, smart buildings, smart cities. So we will have in the future AIs running a city like Edinburgh, running the traffic lights, the whole transport system, the buildings, everything talking to everything else, and happening in the background, making our lives so much easier. And you think, okay, yeah, but I've seen the movies. I know when it can go rogue. Skynet. That's always the example, isn't it, in the Terminator movies, when the machines suddenly become smarter than us and realize they don't need us anymore. Artificial intelligence is coming, and it's increasingly going to pervade our lives. Already, you have your apps on the smartphone that allow you to connect with various appliances with Bluetooth technology and so on, in a way that what we have now on our smartphone would have looked like magic just 5 years ago. What it can do. The new iPhone now that it has facial recognition technology, you just have to look at it to turn it on. Never mind, I still get pleasure from going and buying my coffee and just my thumbprint on my iPhone, click. Oh, just because I don't have to put my hand in my wallet and get some money out. But it's amazing how quickly we get used to this new technology as well. And we have to get used to it quickly because it's changing so quickly, otherwise we'll go mad. But what about artificial intelligence in general? Is it something we should be concerned about? When we build machines and computers that are getting ever more sophisticated, and there's something called the Turing test. The great computer scientist Alan Turing is named after him. The idea is that you have, hidden inside a box, it could be a human or it could be a computer, and you talk to it and you ask it questions and you determine from its answers whether or not it's a real human intelligence or an artificial intelligence. And when a computer can pass the Turing test, many people say, oh, well, that's when they have become as clever and as smart as us. But is that true? They just may be unthinkingly giving the answer that they've been programmed to give to fool us. It doesn't mean that the computer is conscious. But is there any limit? Can a computer, an artificial machine made of whether it's electronics or whatever, that isn't living, actually be sentient and be smart? Computer scientists can't agree on this. And some will say, no, there's something, and without even getting into any sort of theological debates about, well, humans, we have a soul and we have something other, it's non-physical. No, just in terms of, even though the computer scientists will say, yep, I know the brain is just made of atoms and neurons and electric sort of pulses traveling around the brain, but they still don't think a computer could ever be conscious. I don't buy that. I see no reason in principle, so I subscribe to what's called strong AI. I see no reason why, ultimately, a computer couldn't be thinking and be self-aware. You say, oh, well, computers, we humans, we have emotions, happiness, anger, envy. Do you just program a computer to do it? And those emotions we have, it's still software running in our brains. It's not magic. It's just very, very sophisticated. At the moment, we don't have computers that do anything like that. They struggle simply to recognize, a cat from a dog. They may do certain things very, very quickly. They can carry out calculations billions of times faster than a human can. But they've been given instructions to do something. They're doing it unthinkingly. Will there come a day when the light comes on inside the computer, that it becomes conscious and self-aware? Very often people talk about this as the singularity, the point when computers become as smart as or smarter than us. And the worry then is, well, what do they do when they... And of course, once they get smarter than us, exponentially, they will become smarter and smarter. Will there come a point when they realize that we're just surplus to requirements? The cosmologist Max Tegmark, who has in the last few years become essentially a futurist and working on AI, he's just published a new book called Life 3.0. And I like this quote from him: the real worry with advanced AI is not malevolence, a la Skynet and Terminator, but incompetence. Our incompetence in terms of not preparing for what AI can do and how to safeguard against AI controlling the world. Again, here's an example where technology is going to forge ahead, advances are going to be made. You can't put a stop to people wanting to know and wanting to find out. But we should now be thinking about how we put in place the provisions, the precautions, the safety net to stop something bad happening. And I don't think about it in terms of we've got to make sure that computers don't become smarter than us and take over the world. No, I'm talking about the AI that we have today. Autonomous killer drones that the military use, that fly off, seek out enemy targets, and make their own decision whether or not to kill someone or to drop a bomb. You know, they've got a certain set of instructions, and they decide life and death without any human intervention. Or just a more benign example, something like driverless cars. Again, it's happening. You know, some people will say, well, we're going to have driverless cars, but what we're going to need is the human's got to be in there and alert to take over in case they need to. Well, what's the point of having a driverless car then? If you're going to be sitting there with a steering wheel in front of you and your feet, the pedals near your feet, might as well drive it. You know, why hand over to a computer? It's not. We're not talking about cruise control, so you don't have to put your foot on the accelerator. We have that already. No, it's the issues that, and the common example is, what if you have a driverless car driven by a computer, by an artificial intelligence, you, the passenger, are sitting in the back having a nap or whatever, you know, no human is worried about what it's doing, and, you know, and it comes in a woman pushing a pram to cross the road. The car sees, much more quickly than a human can, but it sees it has the option of swerving to avoid the woman and child, but going into a brick wall, killing its passenger. What are the ethical conundrums that AI is going through? Has it been programmed to always look after the safety of its passenger? In which case, does it plow into the woman and child? You know, what sort of moral decision making does it make? Well, people are concerned about that, so you can't leave that to artificial intelligence. Well, what makes you think a human driver making that decision is going to make a better decision? Instinctively, the human driver will probably swerve away and crash. Why couldn't an artificial intelligence also behave in that instinctive way, but actually weigh up lots of, you know, thousands of other implications much more quickly than a human can? But we still don't know. We still don't have the laws in place. We don't have we haven't had the sort of the big discussions. Although, you know, obviously, big technologies, big companies are obviously looking into this. You know, companies like Google and others are developing driverless cars. And we hear all the time on the news that, you know, car manufacturers are already looking ahead to a time, not just to having electric cars, but having these computer-controlled, artificial intelligence-controlled cars. So it's happening. Another example of technology changing so rapidly that we haven't really got the luxury of sitting back and admiring just how wonderful the world can be. We have to really be considering some of what it might mean. There's also, of course, the example of robots taking our jobs. Again, it depends what you read, who you listen to. There's a broad spectrum of opinion as to how much of a crisis this is. After all, with the advent of the silicon chip and the early sort of computer robotics on production lines, for example, back in the 70s, people talked about it, you know, we're going to lose lots of jobs. And we did lose jobs. But people moved on. You know, there's not like there's a huge chunk of the population who are out of work because computers started doing what they were doing. Other skills were developed. Other jobs became available. No one knows for sure how much AI and robotics are going to replace human labor. There'll be jobs that humans, I think, as far as we can tell in the future, will always be better than artificial intelligence at. But what fraction of the workforce is going to be dispensable because an artificial intelligence or a robot can do it more cheaply, more efficiently, more accurately? Again, a discussion that we need to have. That's a lot of that I've said so far is based on the science. How am I doing for time? I can't see my watch in the. It's 1:15, right? Okay. It's shining. It's a stupid watch. I can't see the hands on it. Someone should invent, I don't know, maybe like a digital watch now. Then you could see it really clearly. Most of what I talked about has been the technologies that are coming online based on science that we know today. Stuff that we know, whether it's genetic engineering, whether it's computing, artificial intelligence, whether it's nanotechnology. How will technology develop in the future based on what we know now? But what about the science that we still don't understand? And there's plenty we don't understand. So I thought, for a bit of fun, to end for the last 5 or 10 minutes, to go through a few of my favorite issues. My top 4 physics questions, you wouldn't be surprised probably to see. What is dark matter made of? So this is, 80% or so of all the stuff, matter in the universe, we don't know what it's made of. It's invisible. We only know, all the stuff we see, all the stars and planets and dust and galaxy and everything in the universe that we can see makes a tiny fraction of all the stuff that's out there. There's all this dark matter. We know it's there because it has gravity and it holds galaxies together, but we still don't know what it's made of. Very frustrating. Dark energy is even more frustrating, even more mysterious. It's something that's causing the universe to expand ever more quickly, and we've no idea what it is. Physicists, I don't work on what's called these unified field theories, but people like Stephen Hawking has spent many years. Even Einstein was working on what we now call a theory of everything, a mathematical construct that encompasses all the forces of nature together. We haven't got there yet. Questions like, well, okay, we can understand how the universe evolved from the Big Bang, but was there something before the Big Bang that caused the Big Bang in the first place? Until 10, 20 years ago, that wasn't even a question physicists would answer or would even ask. It was metaphysics. You couldn't. Science can't go back that far. Now they're starting to ask that question. Are there hidden dimensions? We're starting to get to the sort of questions that I get emails, maybe half a dozen a week, from people purporting to have solved all these problems with nothing more than GCSE maths. I don't want to have a go at retired engineers, but by and large, they're retired engineers. And it's really sweet. And you can't say there's a load of nonsense, because they say, woof, no one believed Einstein when he came up with his theory of relativity. And how do you say in a polite way, yeah, but with all due respect, he was Einstein, and you're probably not. But, you may be, but chances are. So there are still huge questions in science. My top overall sexiest science questions, so not just physics now, let's expand outwards. I've already said a little bit about this. Can a machine ever be conscious? Because in order to do that, we also need to understand the nature of consciousness itself. We still don't understand what human consciousness is, let alone how to replicate it in a machine. Is there life elsewhere in the universe? A hugely important question, which again, until a few years ago, if you believe in flying saucers and alien abductions, then, well, of course, they're among us today. But serious science is now actually starting to address this question. Is life on Earth is Earth the only place where life evolved and emerged? Or are there other extraterrestrial life forms, whether under the ice of the moons of Saturn or Jupiter, or whether on some extrasolar planet light years away orbiting another star? Astronomy has advanced so much in the last decade that we're now at the cusp of being able to answer some of these questions. Well, you haven't seen the last one yet. Will quantum teleportation ever be possible? And I'm talking, the Star Trek transporter room teleportation. We can teleport quantum particles now. It's something called quantum entanglement, where you can transfer the state of a particle from one place to another. Not instantaneously, that's a misnomer, but you can do it at the speed of light. Nevertheless, you can teleport down at the particle level. Would we ever be able to teleport an entire human being? It sounds ridiculous, and the technology is, if it's ever possible, it'll be probably hundreds of years away. But there's nothing in principle, according to our understanding of the laws of physics, that would rule it out. But this is not something we're going to see in our lifetimes. Nor is the possibility of time travel. I wanted to end the last few minutes and just say something about Here's the most exotic of sci-fi ideas, the fact that we can travel through time. Might sound like nonsense, but actually time travel into the future is possible. Einstein's theory of relativity says you can slow time down by traveling close to the speed of light or by sitting in a strong gravitational field. Those of you who've seen the film Interstellar, Matthew McConaughey goes and spends a few hours on a planet that's orbiting a supermassive black hole. The gravitational potential is so strong there that his whole time frame, his biological clock, everything runs at a slower rate than clocks on Earth. So I don't want to sort of spoil it for those who are going to see it, but I will. He goes back home, and his young daughter, who's waved goodbye to him when he was on the mission, is now an old lady, because time has gone by so much quicker on Earth. So he's essentially time traveled into the future. Okay, we don't have the rockets that go fast, close to the speed of light, and we haven't found where the nearest big black hole is that we can go and orbit around. But again, we're not violating any laws of physics by saying that time travel into the future is possible. The bigger question, of course, is time travel to the past, because, of course, immediately that leads to all sorts of paradoxes, going back and meeting your younger self and killing your younger self so that you could never grow up to go back to visit your younger self in the first place, and that sort of thing. Of course, Hollywood has had a field day with time travel stories. I thought I'd collect together a few time travel movies. Some are better. Back to the Future is a classic. Looper is actually quite fun. You've got to think about it a bit to make sure that it all makes sense. And then, of course, there's the Terminator. And there's Hot Tub Time Machine. I suggest you avoid. Also, Hot Tub Time Machine 2 was 2 hours of my life I'll never get back. So, you know, and actually the list goes on. There you go. I'll just keep adding more and more, and you give up after some. Hollywood has done time travel. The question is, in reality, could we travel back in time? Well, the interesting thing is, our current best theory of the nature of time is Einstein's general theory of relativity, developed in 1915, so over a century ago. And it says there's no reason, according to the laws of physics and the nature of time as we know it, that rules out time travel. Theoretically, it should be possible. You just have to get your head around all the paradoxes. How? How can you go back and change the past and make it turn out any differently to the way you remember it? There's only one version of history. Well, you know, we're now on the border between proper science and sort of metaphysics, as it were, because you can travel back into the past, provided you subscribe to an even crazier idea, which is that there are lots of parallel universes. And if you travel to the past, you jump out of your reality into a parallel one. When I said at the beginning that the advances that we're going to see in human knowledge, the advances in science, are amazing and unpredictable, I meant it, you know, because most of what I've said, until I got onto the time travel business, most of what I said is pretty much what we might expect to see, based on what we know now. But no one could have predicted the sorts of things that we have now. You know, there were no science fiction writers, you know, the Arthur C. Clarkes of this world, who were so prescient about predicting technologies and advances. I'm not aware of any who predicted the rise of the internet. Maybe some did in some way, but you know, and you know, the idea of using your smartphone, which is just a pocket computer. Okay, maybe in Star Trek it was that sort of idea. You know, you talk and you see a picture of someone. But some of the advances that we see in science, no one could have anticipated. So we shouldn't be surprised if things that today seem like magic to us, but in the future they're commonplace. Because you take someone from a century ago and supplant them here in 2017, and some of the science and the technology they'll see will be nothing short of magic to them. So what is that equivalent? What would appear like magic to us if we were transplanted 1 century into the future? I just want to end with this nice Danish proverb: predicting is difficult, especially when dealing with the future. Thank you very much.
thank you, Jim, for that. You have covered so much ground. I don't know about anybody else, but my head is reeling and spinning as I think through all the things that you've gone over. And what I really wonder is, what would John Napier make of all that? He died 400 years ago. He sat in an office down the road from here in one of our other campuses, and I don't think you could even begin to think about, conceptualize the advances that we've made. But for me, the message that's come out the most strong from your talk is not the advances themselves, but the rate of change and how that's growing. And all we do know is that it's going to grow even more, but we don't know where that's going to take us. And I was also particularly struck about, there seems to me there's a growing responsibility on us who are scientists, who are engineers, to also think about the implications, to think about the ethics. So lots for us to discuss over the rest of this evening, and I dare say beyond. But before we break for drinks down the stairs, we do have time for a few questions. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions, but it'd be really good to get our evening's discussion off the ground, to take 2 or 3 questions from the floor. So we do have roving mics here, so if you've got a question that you would like to ask, please indicate and we'll get the mic to you. Gentlemen there, please.
Thank you for an illuminating lecture. Very simple question. Do you think our politicians and educators are sufficiently aware of all you've been telling us about this evening?
I'm actually more optimistic than you might think, because very often we look at our representatives in government and we see a distinct lack of scientific training. But what is good these days is that we have scientific advisors who advise government. And there are people, these are people who understand that, the importance of evidence and evidence-based policies, but also understand that governments, when they make decisions, they're not just basing it on the science, they're basing it on economics and public opinion and so on. And by and large, those in government who are responsible, they're smart enough to understand. They may not understand the science, but they're smart enough to understand, to get the people who do know the science to give them good advice. There are always worries and issues when you look at science committees in government down in Westminster that comprise people who believe in various pseudo-scientific ideas, that you can worry whether they have an influence or not. But part of the encouragement I feel is because I compare Britain and Europe with the state in America. And there, if I was living in America, I wouldn't be giving the same answer, because of the cuts in funding and the anti-scientific sentiment, the climate change denying, the cuts in fundamental science research, whether it's NASA or the environment and so on. So they really have a problem. But I think in the UK, by and large, and we've had reasonable science ministers. A past example is David Willits, who is now chair of the British Science Association. He wasn't a scientist, but by and large, universities and scientists, certainly working in academia, knew that he was smart enough to get it, so he would be willing to listen. And I'd like to think that, science ministers and those who control the budgets for how much we spend on R&D listen to the correct advice.
There's a question up at the back there.
Throughout your talk, you mentioned many times the importance, effectively, of philosophy alongside science. So we have the philosophy of mind, philosophy of ethics, informing science. Given our current education policy, where the humanities are really being undermined, and the STEM subjects are really being celebrated, largely because of their contribution to the economy, what are the possibilities for a good, balanced education in our current system? And is there a threat to science?
I've been involved over a number of years with the Royal Society down in London, looking at provision of science education all the way through, from age 5 to 18. And one of the recommendations that we made very strongly was there needs to be some sort of continuing of science and maths education up to the age of 18. But at the same time, the understanding that those who go into STEM subjects should be exposed to some of the ideas that come from the philosophy, ethics side, the understanding of why they do what they do. The education system has been tinkered with forever. And I don't think I think in the broader education that secondary school kids have in Scotland is far more enlightened than they do in England, where you have the rigid A-level system of just disregarding everything but those subjects needed for your university education. That's very narrow. I don't think we can change it overnight. But how do you ensure that the students studying STEM subjects are exposed to ideas from the humanities, those who go into the arts and humanities understand something about the scientific method? Maybe there used to be an A-level called General Studies that became obsolete. It was just some way for students to get extra UCAS points. It wasn't really very useful. But, I think increasingly we see a need for some way of getting students at school to understand the moral philosophy behind some of these technological advances. And I am not one of those scientists who believes that philosophy is dead. Science tries to answer the questions about the world. Philosophy sets out the questions that should be asked in the first place. And I think that's vitally important. And it's a shame we don't teach our youngsters enough about asking the right questions, for example.
Could I ask whether you think the possibility of Homo sapiens might become extinct as a species which breaks all the rules of evolutionary biology compared with nearly all species since 2.2 million years of evolution? I suggest that it's a possibility.
I think that's right, and I think that's what is tackled in that book by Max Tegmark, Life 3.0. We are not the culmination of evolutionary advance. We're just one step along the way. But even if you just leave out technology and our ability to meddle with our own evolution, we are going to evolve and change. What's happening is that technology is allowing us to do that so much more quickly. So yeah, I think it's going to very rapidly come to the point where we can play with the software. We can learn stuff, we can think, but we're getting to the point where we can play with the hardware of life as well. And that does mean that Darwinian evolution will be far too slow for us because we can evolve things in advance what Homo sapiens is much more quickly. Yeah, it is an issue, whether it's we call it transhumanism, or whether we call it AI, robots, and androids taking over humans. Things are going to change, and again, we have to be prepared for it.
And there's a question at the back there.
Yes, thanks. I was just very pleased that you touched on the subject of automation and how it affects society. And I believe that's really a very fundamental issue in today's world. And I do remember in the 70s when automation first became important to society, that we were all promised a 15-hour week for the same wage and the life of Riley. Well, it didn't actually happen. We're all still drudging at 35, 40 hours a week, and many of us much more. And our prosperity hasn't grown in kind. In fact, society at large has got poorer in many ways. And I just wonder if we follow that trend to automation and AI, will it be a new glorious age where we've got our own slaves and we have a fantastic life? Or will we be even poorer and more miserable? And it's not a science question, but it is very important to society.
Yeah, I think I go back to this quote. It's very difficult to predict how the future is. I think my point is we shouldn't be comforted by the lessons of the past when it comes to the way technology is changing our lives, and to say that, well, this is how it's affected us. It didn't lead to huge changes, as you say. In many ways, it leads to a poorer society. But it's too hard to predict. It could go either way. We just have to be prepared for the different paths it could take, and try and as much as we can to steer it in the right direction. It's that warning that we can't just sit back and allow the future to unfold for us.
And we've got time for one more question.
I just wanted to ask you that during the course of your interviews on the Life Scientific, who were you most fascinated by?
Usually it's the surprising ones. I mean, a lot of the scientists that I interview are mates. Others are people that I've admired and looked up to, but whose work I know very well. And others have done work that, I personally hadn't heard of them. And then I felt ashamed that I hadn't heard of them, because I realized how much they've done, because it's a field completely different to mine. They've changed the world, and I should have known about this. But I'd go, it's hard to beat the experience of interviewing Peter Higgs. Edinburgh-based, and because I remember in the interview, I asked him to explain the Higgs boson. So, well, you're the man to ask, you're here, can you tell us what the Higgs boson is? Can you explain what the Higgs boson is in 2 or 3 minutes? And so he does, and as he's explaining it, I'm thinking, this is not going to make it. This is all going to be cut, because it's not live. We record for an hour, hour and a half, and cut down to half an hour. So, well, no one will understand. It's beautiful. And at the end of it, he sees me nodding and smiling, and he says, what was that? I said, that was beautifully explained. He said, but not very good for the general public. So I said, well, okay, so here's the challenge. Can you explain what the Higgs boson is? Just encapsulate it in 30 seconds. I said, no. So, can you do it in a minute? Nope. I said, oh, God, this is not going very well. But then what he then beautifully said afterwards was, but why should you expect me to be able to? I said, I've spent most of my life trying to understand this deep, complex subject, developing the mathematics for it. It's really difficult. Why should you expect me to put it in a soundbite? And the great physicist Richard Feynman said something similar. I don't know how apocryphal this is, because Richard Feynman tends to elaborate his stories as he went through his life. But he said some journalists asked him when he'd won his Nobel Prize in quantum electrodynamics. I won't go into what it means. And the journalist said, can you explain what it is in a sentence? And he said, well, if I could, it wouldn't be worth a Nobel Prize. So I think that for me, the Peter Higgs explanation, and by the way, that whole discussion and the 2-minute, all made it into the program, because it was an example of sometimes science isn't all about the snappy, all you have to do is find the right words to explain it. And sometimes it's difficult. So for me, Peter Higgs will probably be my all-time favorite.
I'm just going to sneak in one final question.
How is the progress going with trying to discover the graviton?
Oh, well, we've only just discovered gravitational waves. So the graviton is the particle of the gravitational force. Physicists are having a discussion here, by the way. Excuse us. But in the same way that the photon is the particle of light, the particle of electromagnetic force, the graviton is the particle of gravity. But it only makes sense if we could describe gravity in the same way that we describe all the other forces using quantum mechanics. And the big holy grail in physics is, how do you get gravity joined up with quantum mechanics? And we still don't know how to do it, so we still don't know whether graviton actually exists or not. And it'll take a long time to find a particle of gravity, because the force of gravity is so much weaker than the other forces. The graviton will be much more difficult, much more elusive to find. We've only, I mean, we're still sort of wallowing in the glow of discovering gravitational waves, which is much easier to do than gravitons, and that took us half a century. So gravitons, well, maybe, you know, by the time you're a physics professor, maybe it'll be ripe. So I'll just put the responsibility onto your shoulders.
Obviously look forward to welcoming you back to talk to an audience in 25 years' time. I'm just going to throw in one little question at the end, Jim. If you could go back in time, who would you go back, which scientist would you go back in time and interview for your radio show?
A toss-up between Niels Bohr, the founder of quantum mechanics, but Niels Bohr was famously obscure in what he did. So Richard Feynman, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you all for coming along and helping us to celebrate, commemorate the life of John Napier, but actually more importantly, to help us in celebrating the contributions that science and engineering are making to present-day life and addressing big challenges, and also to recognise that we also need a bit of ethics and philosophy in that as well. I hope you can join us down the stairs for a drink and some canapes and to continue the conversations and the questions. And finally, please do join me once again in thanking Jim for his talk. Really, really thought-provoking.
Thank you very much. Thank you.